Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're celebrating the birthday of Dr. Dre, my favorite hip-hop producer, and someone who permanently changed what hip-hop and rap were to audiences around the world that were still just beginning to understand and embrace this new art form. Now, before getting into some things that anger me about what the critics say and what some of the fans say about Dre, because they've sort of, through osmosis, taken on what these idiotic critics have said, let's keep it positive and talk about all of the great pioneering moves Dre made. Now, Dr. Dre was someone who, from an early age, was immersed in music, listening to records, understanding what various composers and various performers were all about, listening to people like Herbie Hancock, listening to George Clinton, listening to Roy Ayers, listening to all of the true greats of soul, funk, jazz fusion, other forms of jazz, you name it, every genre, rock, classical, everything. And he's very open about the fact that he's sort of a musical sponge and connoisseur who sucks in everything that he's heard and who's able to process sort of the placement of this music, where it should go in his own craft. And because of this great ear, you could really consider Dr. Dre sort of the first arranger, the first great arranger of hip hop. Because before Dre, samples were just a matter of finding something over which you could rap your lyrics. Hip hop and rap in particular is a lyrical art form. But Dre changed that in the sense that he elevated the sampling, the music itself, to a level that was equally complementary to the poetry, to the lyrics, and to the delivery of the rap itself. Now, as we all know, there was the World Class Wrecking Crew where Dre got his start, but for the wider world outside of sort of Compton, Watts, and neighboring areas, we got to experience NWA as the first great entry of Dr. Dre into the world as a producer. And wow, it took the world by storm. NWA just sounded fresher. Lyrically, it was much more scathing. They called it reality rap, then the industry named it gangster rap. But there was still a lot more in store for Dre because he wanted an altogether slicker, more narrative and more musical style of production. And you can see in producing the DOC's original singles and his album, in producing the second NWA album, you see that Dre is getting closer and closer to what would eventually become his signature sound. And that signature sound really happened in terms of a single that he isn't even a fan of, but one that helped introduce Snoop Dogg to the world. And this was Deep Cover. It was leaner, it was meaner, it was funkier, it was really just well produced and well put together. But it was on his first album, The Chronic, where you really got to see Dre paint sort of musical narratives with his sampling, and more importantly, by recreating the melodies and the hooks and the rhythms of the music he would have sampled, and that again using real instruments and real musicians to recreate the samples rather than just using the record itself. That became a major staple of Dre. The Chronic was an all analog record. It's got that warmth, it's got that realism, and from beginning to end, you just that the first time you heard it, it's one of those things where it's like a Dark Side of the Moon or a Pet Sounds. The first time that you heard The Chronic and you know who you are, you were blown away because it sounded unlike any rap or hip hop record ever before made at that point. It just, the sound was more cohesive and it had all of those great qualities that made up G-Funk, which became it became the basis of the beat, the soundtrack, if you will, behind the West Coast style. It was implicit to the West Coast style, just as sure as the reality raps that Ice-T first did on the West Coast, albeit influenced by people like Schoolie D and then NWA. And when you married that West Coast gangster style with the G-Funk music that Dre was creating, it was a match made in heaven. And as I said before, G-Funk is sort of very prominent with the lead synth. Think a Moog synthesizer playing lead. Think of the bass turned way up. Think of it a bit bit slowed down and more in the groove, more in the pocket. And think of instead of just trying to throw as many samples into one song as possible, everything is a bit more drawn out and again, narrative. You could even say cinematic. And The Chronic became a huge hit, and it's become so successful that it's now sort of become popular for some arrogant critics not to like it because, oh, it went mainstream. Well, where did Dre come from? Where did NWA come from? Where did World Class Wrecking Crew come from? Dre wasn't parachuted in from Hollywood by the record industry. He was someone that came up through the underground, through the culture, and became successful. And some people seem to hate him for that. And I find that really stupid and really anti-artistic. His production genius continued with Snoop Doggy Dogg, as he was known then, with the Doggy Style album, and that continued the G-Funk sound. And there was an entire orbit of people around Dre who were also great producers in this style. There was, of course, his cousin Warren G, one of my other favorite producers ever. There was Daz Dillinger, and it really just Dre's creations really helped to solidify the West Coast as a region that went from being sort of mocked in the 80s by the New York guys to one that in the 90s dominated and changed the hip hop sound because after the Chronic and Doggy Style, everyone in the hip hop universe wanted to sound like Dr. Dre and Warren G and Dillinger and yep, DJ Quick, Sir Jinx, so many other great DJ Poot West Coast producers at the time, all of whom were embracing some variety of the G-Funk sound. Now, not ever one to sit on his laurels, Dre threw it all away in the mid 90s after working with Tupac on what, in many ways, is his most memorable song for in terms of mass consumption, California Love. He walked away from the record label Death Row that he created with Suge Knight, and it took a while for him, not that long, but a few years to get back into the limelight. But the patience was rewarded because in 1999 he came out with The Chronic 2001 and once again reinvented hip hop, this time even more cinematic, if you will. And again, the acoustic instruments even more pronounced than on The Chronic. Both of these albums really complementary to each other. Many of the same people were featured. Snoop Dogg, who's obviously his most close collaborator after all those years, but there were also new faces, people like Exhibit. Corrupt was there, but he had been part of that family for a while, and Eminem, who at that time was a new figure that Dre had discovered. Now, Dre's continued to both discover and produce a lot of other talent, and at the Super Bowl halftime show a few years back, he showcased some of his biggest finds, if you will, starting with Snoop, and then you had 50 Cent, you had Eminem, you had Kendrick, you had Mary J. Blige. So he really worked with and discovered people across musical spectrums, male, female, pop, hip hop, just an altogether musical visionary. And, you know, the joke from 99 is that people forgot about Dre, but I think it's almost that people would like to forget about him because it's hard to really avoid his influence on turning hip hop into something where the production and the musicality is, like I said, equally important to the poetry. And I think that for that, he'll always be remembered as one of the greats, I would say the greatest producer in hip hop history. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, and as always, we'll see you next time.